Good evening. Welcome, everybody. It's such a huge pleasure to have you all here, and really huge pleasure to welcome Layla Saad here with me. And I'm just looking forward to this conversation so much this evening, and I'm sure you are too. I am Pragya Agarwal, and I'm a behavioral and data scientist and an author and speaker. And what can I say about Layla Saad? I'm sure you all know her and her amazing work. Layla is an author, speaker, and teacher on the topics of race, identity, leadership, personal transformation, and social change. And she is the New York Times and Sunday Times best-selling author of the groundbreaking book, Me and White Supremacy, which was published in 2020. And if you haven't read that book, you should, because it is a transformational book and it's transformational work. Layla is also the host of Good Ancestor podcast and the founder of the Good Ancestor Book Club. I just find your work so inspirational, Layla, and welcome here. How are you today?
Thank you, Pragya. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you. You know, I love you. And, you've been a guest of ours both on the podcast and the book club. And so it's always such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And I know this is going to be a wonderful conversation for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. And same here. I share those sentiments completely. And we are here to talk about Layla's new book, which is Me and White Supremacy. And it is a young adult edition of your former book, Me and White Supremacy, which was, as I said, New York Times and Sunday Times bestseller. And I'm just I think the way you tackle white supremacy and the oppressive systems around it and privilege, and just kind of demystify some of these really complex notions which people skirt around and don't want to talk about, is really, you make them so accessible. I think to start off with, I would love for you to find out from you, how did you get to this book from your previous book of Me and White Supremacy? How did you come to this book? What was your process, thinking process? And why did you think this book was so needed, do you think?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey to journey from the adult edition, which, like you said, was published in 2020. I mean, that book was its own journey. It started off as an Instagram challenge in 2018, a free workbook later that year, and then the published book in 2020. And at each stage of writing that book, the adult edition, I researched and I expanded it and I added my own personal stories, and I tried as much as possible at each stage to try and make these topics and these concepts, which seem to those of us who are not academics, those of us who are not, entrenched in that work, seem more accessible, more understandable to our everyday lived experiences, as opposed to something that is happening out there. White supremacy, something separate to me. It's not a part of my life. I really wanted to help people to understand how it is a part of their life and how they can change the role that it plays and become more active in its dismantling. I always knew when I was writing the adult edition of the book that I would write a young reader's edition. But I kind of was like, that's a separate project and I'll get to that when I get to it. I wanted to focus first on the adult edition. When that was done and it was out in the world, it was now time to focus on this young adult edition. And initially, I had thought that it would just be a straight adaptation. We're going to take the adult edition. I'm going to work with children's editors, children's team to help me adapt it for a younger audience. But in essence, it's the same book. It's just for a younger audience. As I sat down to, map it out and do the process, I came across some pretty big issues that were very important from the very beginning. And I'm glad that they came up really early, because they changed the entire way that this book then was written, and how it was no longer just an adaptation, but an entirely new book in and of itself. That first stumbling block, or that first challenge, was recognizing that, how is this book going to be used? Okay, individual kids are going to read it, but maybe it's going to be used in schools. Okay, so if it's a straight adaptation, the adult book is written for adults who have white privilege. That means this one would also be for kids who have white privilege. What happens to Black kids? What happens to kids of color? Where do they sit in this? And isn't it also important for them to have a deep, complex, nuanced understanding of white supremacy and how it functions in their lives, and the role that it plays in their lives, and how they may be participating in it and affected by it? And so I had to take a big step back and really think about, okay, what am I actually trying to accomplish here? What is the bigger picture? And I recognize that the bigger picture is we want to raise and equip a younger generation to be able to grow up into adults who understand how the systems of oppression work and function in their lives, who are comfortable having conversations with each other across racial lines, right? Who are empathetic to each other's experiences, and who can work together, because this is collective communal work, how they can work together to become anti-racist change makers. And so I cannot just adapt the adult book into a young adult edition. I have to really think about, how does this book now need to be written? Now, I knew that it would still be important to have the kind of chapters, the steps that I walk out in the adult edition, you know, things like what is white privilege, tone policing, cultural appropriation, white feminism, and so on. But now within the chapters, how do I have a conversation with essentially two different audiences, kids who have white privilege and those who don't, and still make each reader feel like I'm talking to them specifically, while also addressing the fact that depending on your privilege, how you respond to white supremacy and what you need to reflect on is often going to be quite different, right? And so that within the chapters, what you'll see, especially at the end of each chapter, is the recap, reflect, and respond sections, where they recap on what is this thing we've been talking about in this chapter, and then we reflect. We ask those reflective journaling questions, and quite often I had to split the questions into like, these are the questions if you have white privilege, and these are the questions if you don't. And then the respond was how to respond to white supremacy, how to respond to this aspect of white supremacy. And again, there were often, not always, but often different responses if you had white privilege versus if you didn't, right? And so that was kind of like a technical, like, how do I make this into this book that could be two books into one book?
Yeah.
The other, yeah.
No, I think I was just going to say that I think that's the biggest strength. And I think that is something that I have personally found missing in the conversation around race education as well, because it has often centered children with white heritage, who are white,
yes,
and that we are educating them to be allies or to be anti-racist. But
yes.
as you know, that I personally feel that it has to take an intersectional stance, and it has that every child has to feel very confident in their own identity, racial identity. And so we have to do this work with everybody so that they feel confident. And while we dismantle white supremacy, we have to talk about privilege in a very intersectional, rounded way.
Absolutely.
So that's why I think it kind of really, that's one of the strengths. And that can be difficult, but you've definitely managed to deal with that.
It took time, Pragya. I will say that. It felt, while I was trying to do it, it felt clunky. You know, I knew how I wanted it to be at the end. I wanted it to feel like a very smooth read, but it felt clunky because essentially I'm talking to two different audiences in one book. But I think what brought it together was an understanding that, like I said, all kids need to understand the historical context as well as the modern day context. They all need to understand how these things function, and then they need to understand what that means for them, right? And so there's a lot of historical context as well, which isn't in the adult edition. I wanted to give them a little bit of background about how European colonialism works, and scientific racism and things like that got us to where we are today. And there's also, and this was sort of in the adult edition, but it's more so in this one, a part where we're actually ask them to stop and really reflect on how they're feeling, and help them to give words to the emotions that may be coming up, really making them understand that whatever you're feeling here is valid.
Mm,
right?
mm,
If it's frustration, if it's guilt, if it's shame, if it's confusion, frustration, all of those things are valid. And let's give you some ways to healthily work through them and process them, as well as some affirmations to give you the steam to keep on going, right? And that
yeah.
constant reminder that you're not alone on this journey. There's other young readers who are doing it with you, and there's also so many adults who have been on the same journey as well. So I wanted them to feel, I know it's tough, but you'll be okay, and other people are on this journey with you.
Yeah, I think it's so important to create that kind of non-judgmental space where they're
Mm-hmm.
free to express how they're feeling. And
Yeah,
often we shy away from discomfort. And I think adults,
right.
teachers, carers, parents can often shy away from that discomfort because we haven't still maybe unlearned some of our own
That's
prejudices
right.
or the conditioning that we've had while we were growing up. So this is a young adult. So what age group do you think this
Yeah.
is?
I would
You
say the
start.
widest range I would say is 10 to 16. I think the kind of more perfect age would be probably 11 to 15, around that age. But it also depends. Each child is different. You
Yeah.
have 10-year-olds who are very mature, who may be able to tackle some of those concepts. I mean, my son, who's 7, started reading it because I had some uncorrected bound proofs, and so he was reading it, and he had lots of questions, right? so
Amazing.
uh, yeah,
So you have mixed heritage children, and I'm coming from the perspective that I have mixed race children, and I've talked a lot about my journey with my eldest daughter, who was born in India and she grew up here, and then I have mixed heritage children, and that kind of got me thinking about how we need to start thinking about these prejudices and biases that children pick up from a very young age, and how do I make sure that they feel comfortable in this identity, which is not mixed but their whole identity, that they feel
right.
comfortable about choosing whatever aspect they want to choose without feeling constrained by these identities.
That's
So
right. That's
how's your
right.
personal experience shaped some of this work?
Mm. Ooh, I've always been a third culture kid. So somebody who grew up in a culture that is not the culture of their parents. And I think, and I'm my sort of mixed heritage is East African and Arab or Middle Eastern. Um, and so that's I've never seen when other people are seeing you, they're like, you're this and you're this
Yeah,
and you're this. When you see
later.
yourself, it's just, I'm Layla,
Yeah.
right? These are all the things that make up who I am. But as I grew up, I really began to understand the different aspects of who I am, and the way that ethnicity and culture, and race, and even residency, like where you live, all of these things shape an outlook. I think part of being a third culture kid married to another third culture kid, and we have children who are third culture kids of third culture adults, really has given us a broad perspective to be able to kind of have an understanding of how other people may be moving through the world, or the ways that they may be seeing other people or may be seen as well. And so I think that gives me a way to kind of, I can see it from this perspective, but I can also see it from this perspective as well. And my father always raised us to be citizens of the world. Like when people ask him, like, where are you from, he would say, I'm a citizen of the world. I think part of it was that he didn't want to be boxed into one thing, but also I think deeper than that is that he wanted us to feel like there's no place on this earth where you don't belong, and you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You don't have to prove your beingness or your worthiness to anyone. And so even within the book, throughout the book, I keep reminding them, like, who you are as you are is wonderful and perfect, and you don't have to be anything else other than this. It's just about doing the work to make sure that everyone feels that way too.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that is something I found really touching, and I wish I had that when I was growing up, because I think that strong sense of somebody telling you are okay the way you are, you're
Yes.
good the way you are, you don't need
Yeah.
to conform to any norms, because this is ultimately a discussion about how our societal norms are, and whoever is
Right.
not part of the norm is marginalized, right? And you can feel
Mm-hmm.
like that you're not the mainstream, and you'd always, the teenage years are particularly tricky in those ways, aren't they? Because you're
Yeah.
trying to fit in, and when you bring in the whole racial identity or ethnicity into the mix, then it can become quite difficult, especially if a child is growing up in where they are the minority
Mm-hmm.
person. So I
Mm-hmm.
think I found that notion of belonging, the idea related to this learning is
Mm.
really interesting, the way you've talked about it. Um, I was really curious about how do you anticipate, I mean, how do you think people should introduce this book to young
Mm.
adults, and how would they go about this
Yeah.
journey?
Yeah, because it's not just like it's just not it's not just like a book that you can just pick up and read and sort of,
Yeah,
and then move on to the next thing, right? It's an involved process, right? It's a book, like with the adult edition, it's a book that you do, not just a book that you read. And so I
mm-hmm.
think it's really important for the adults introducing this work to the young people in their lives to have a sense of mindfulness about the journey that the young people in their lives will be going on, and really be thinking about how can I best prepare myself so that I'm able to hold space for them that is safe, non-judgmental, open and curious, and really allow them to, like you said, be vulnerable, express their emotions. And so I think one of the easiest, best places to start is to read slash do the Me and White Supremacy young adult edition. I think especially for adults who have white privilege, I think the doing part is going to be really important. I think for those who don't have white privilege, Black and brown people, people of color, the book wasn't made for us to do, but I think reading through it, oftentimes I've heard so often that it's brought up a lot for people. It's quite emotional. It makes them reflect on their own lives, the way that they moved through the world and how they thought of themselves, especially growing up, right? And so it can bring up stuff, right? And so you want to make sure that you've kind of had that process for yourself first and given yourself that space, so that when you're holding space for the young people in your life, you're not triggered by something that they are now experiencing or thinking about or asking you a question about, that you don't shut down their curiosity because you're not ready to yet have that conversation, right? I've tried to make the book as much of a kind of self-contained process as possible, with as much cheerleading and championing and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not it's best not to do it alone. It's best to have someone that you can talk to about it. It's best to have someone that you can ask questions about how this applies to your life. And so whether it's parents, older siblings, aunts, uncles, teachers, librarians, whoever it is that can hold that space, I think it's very important that they prepare themselves by just having the willingness to go on that journey. And it might be that you didn't have the adult edition and you weren't able to go through it, but maybe you've read other books or watched documentaries, or maybe that you want to go on the journey with the young people in your life and you do it together. I think when I was writing this book and I got to the end, I was like, I think a lot of adults would really benefit from this, actually, because other than the fact that I had to use a lot more like pop culture references to things so that it was applicable to a younger audience. But some of the questions, the way that I explain things, is very different to the adult edition. And so for anybody wanting to start or take it deeper again, I think you can actually go through the young adult edition and find that it does allow you to learn and to expand and to grow. But I think what's most important is, like I said, that understanding that I have a responsibility to hold safe space for this person in my life who's going to go on this journey. And no matter what, like, just don't shut down their vulnerability. Don't shut down their curiosity. if it's triggering for you, which can happen, allow yourself the space to step back and say, hey, I got to figure this out for myself first, and then I'll come back and answer the question. You don't have to have all the answers. I think that's really important to know. None of us do. Like,
no,
none
no.
of us do.
I mean,
We're all learning.
we can pretend, but we would never have all the.
Right.
And I think it's okay for children to see that vulnerability, to admit
Mhm.
mistakes. And I've always said
Mhm.
that when you start this conversation about race and racism with children, we have to, as parents, carers, teachers, have to unlearn our own biases and
Absolutely.
prejudices that we were ingrained with while we were growing up, because we have to learn how to sit with discomfort, and we have to
Yeah.
learn to say, actually, I don't know the answer to this. Let's work it out together. And it's, as you say,
Together,
it's a
right.
collaborative process.
Yes.
And to give that space. And yeah, I think children will ask questions, and there might be things that children say that you think, oh my gosh, the panic but starts building, saying, oh my gosh, my child is going to be a racist or something.
Right.
But no, I think children will express things, and those can be, I call them teachable moments. So I
Absolutely.
think, and that is
Yeah.
really important. We can't do that work because children are like sponges, especially when they're
Yes.
younger. They're picking up
Yes.
implicit messages and words and
Yes.
actions. We can't just bombard them with educational material and not do the work ourselves, because they are
Yeah.
seeing everything we are doing around them as well.
Absolutely.
So I think that's
Yeah.
really important to do. And I think the kind of the way that the book is laid out, I find really interesting as well, in those boxes. So it's highlighting
Mhm.
those things about race being a social construct, and it's not,
Yes.
but racism is really real, and the social idea of race. Because I think, and when you talk about the different levels of racism, I think that's really interesting in the book as well, because I think sometimes parents or adults don't have the vocabulary to talk about these
That's
concepts,
right.
and then that's why they don't feel equipped.
Yeah.
So they feel shy about talking about
Yeah.
it, or feel like I'm
Yeah.
going to make a mistake or say something wrong. And as you say in your book, it's okay to make those mistakes, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, we're both, I mean, I love, obviously we've read your book, Motherhood, and I'm looking forward to your next book as well. And what I love about your approach is that it's just so well researched, and there's so much in there for the brain to like, oh, I want to know more about that and more about that. But you, Pragya, are not walking around with all of this knowledge just in your head, right? You've had to go out and learn and find out new things. You may have had assumptions or presumptions, and then you go and find either that's true or that's not, or there's stories that I wasn't aware of. I mentioned that I kind of have these history lessons at the beginning of the book, where I talk about the roots of global white supremacy through European colonialism. I know that colonialism was a thing that happened. I don't know the history of colonialism.
Yeah.
I had to go and do that research myself and understand. And I uncovered a lot of things that I just wasn't aware of, hadn't heard of, and then had to take that and distill that into something that made sense for that readership. But I'm constantly learning, right? And I think that is important. I know that when we put out a book, it's like, oh, this person must be an expert and they know everything. No, I'm just constantly learning, right? And we have to allow ourselves to be, that's what life is. We're constantly growing, we're constantly learning.
But we are constantly unlearning as well. I think that's
as
really
well.
important.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think we have to give ourselves freedom to unlearn some of the things we've learned, which we think that this is the way we were brought up, or things we saw when we were growing up, or things that we thought were right. But we have to allow ourselves to unlearn. And I think also children are not born, as I've said in my book, Wish We Knew, children are not born with racial prejudice. They pick up these messages. So if we learn these things, then we can unlearn them as well, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
I think one of the things that I found really interesting when I wrote my book, which was for parents and carers about, and it was for younger children, Wish We Knew What to Say, is that somebody said, oh, I thought it'll be like really quick fix, like tips, and I will just pick them up, but it just doesn't give me that. So I don't find that useful. And one person said that.
That's
and
so
I was
funny. That's so funny.
And I
would
thought,
it be easy if it was, if we could just fix the world's problems? It's just like, here's your top 5, things to do.
And I just wanted to say that about this book, that even though you lay it out so clearly and you're giving everything in bite size, you can't expect people to not do the work, right?
Right,
It's not a
right.
quick fix template that can be
Yeah,
applied to it. So
yeah. Well, look, and information is not a guarantee of transformation, right? Information allows us to learn the things that we didn't know, right? Allows us to question and to think, but it really is quite meaningless without action behind it. How do we actually apply this? And that requires each one of us taking personal responsibility, and seeing, and this is, I talk so much about being a good ancestor. This is about thinking about what is my role here to play? What are the steps and the actions that I can take to help make the world a better place? And somehow we learn the books, yes, read the books. We know that there is a thirst and an appetite right now for these kind of books. Yeah. But if it's just like, that's another book that we read in the book club, or that's just another book that I've added to my TBR list, but I'm not actually applying it, then it's quite meaningless. I mean, even within the book club that I run, I'm often saying, make sure that when you read this chapter, or you read this book and you get to the end, you're thinking about, how does this apply to my life? And what action can I take? Even if it's a fiction book, right? What does this mean? And how can this book change how I show up in the world, for me to be better? We have to take that action, that information, and action it. And that's on people. If reading a book was all it took to change the world, then it would have happened a long time ago.
Exactly. I love what you said. Information is not transformation. I'm going to get it printed out and put it in my study in a big poster. No, that's fantastic, because I do think that sometimes there is this tendency that you can have a template and a quick fix to things. Like, even when I'm asked to give talks about bias or unconscious bias, people say, give us tips about what we change, or is there a training for it? And I say, I don't like using the word training, and I wouldn't, for your book, I wouldn't say it's a training manual or anything like that either, because you can't train people out of this, like in a half an hour, or whatever time it takes to. It has to be a consistent process, a regular process of reflection, isn't it?
This is also an intergenerational journey that we're on. We're talking about things that have been in place for centuries. Reading a book about it in 2022 isn't going to magically change that. It's our responsibility to figure out the work that we're doing now in our generation, so that the next generation have it easier, and they will pick up their work for what they need to be doing. And that's what I'm hoping with this book, that they are kind of activated into what is our work for our generation, right? But we're talking about a really long journey here, which you and I know, this work is long overdue, because racism, white supremacy shouldn't exist. Its very premise is a lie. The idea that people who are white or who look white are superior to other people of other races, and therefore they deserve to dominate over those races, is a complete lie. We shouldn't even be having this conversation, right? But it's what it is, because of power, right? And so we have to understand we're on a very long intergenerational journey, and at each stage we're kind of I see us as part of the fabric of humanity and humanity's story, from not to get like all Star Wars on you, but kind of like darkness into light, right? From the dark side to the right. So what is the role that each and so sometimes I think people hear that and they kind of feel overwhelmed and think, well, if we can't solve it now, then what's the point, right? But if everyone thought that, then we would just stay the same, right? So whatever role you can play in your life, that means your life as a mother or father, your life in your workplace, your life, with your friends, whatever role you can play there, that's enough.
Yeah, and I think the first step, as you said, is acknowledging that these systems of oppression or these hierarchical structures that are so deeply embedded in our systems are not the truth that we assume
Yes.
them to be. They are, as you said, in eugenics or race science, or they were
Yes.
created to justify this oppression, but they become so deeply embedded that we just believe them to be
Right.
truth. And I think, as you say, also it's breaking the cycle of the intergenerational trauma as well. I
That's
think because
right.
that trauma carries through, and we don't want to pass on that trauma to our
Right.
children, the
Absolutely.
that our previous generations have faced, or we have faced, or we don't want that. And it's the everyday microaggressions, those kind of things that are
Yeah.
reflected, the white supremacy or the oppression is reflected on those kind of things
Right.
as well. And I really love the idea of this book, and I would love to see it being coordinated with the rest of the curriculum rather than just standing apart in one, oh, we've done this book,
I
because
would
I
love
think
that too. Right.
yeah, I think it would link so
What does
well
this
with
mean? Right.
history.
What
Yeah,
does this mean for our history lessons? What
yeah,
does this mean for our
yeah,
geography
exactly.
lessons? What does this mean for our English lessons and our science lessons? It's all connected
Yeah,
together. And I really hope that that's the case too.
yeah. I think any anti-racism journey or any education has to be coordinated, and so that we give children a critical thinking skills, so that they can
Yes.
think for themselves and make better
Yes.
decisions. All children,
Mhm.
um, and I mean, what is your hope for this book? Like, besides it
Mm.
being coordinated.
Well, I think you just said it. I love that vision that you've just said. And I hope that that is something that happens, that this isn't seen as something that is separate to our young people's growth and evolution into adults, right? This is a key part of their growth into healthy human beings. This is a
Yeah,
key part into their growth as empathetic human beings who can actually use their creativity for good, right? And use their power for good. This will help them to. It's not just a. This is a great side project to do, because it's good to not be racist, right?
yes.
Right. This is actually
Tick a
it's really
box.
really exactly, it's really
Yeah,
integral to the state of the world that we have. And just like this subject would apply to, like you said, all of those classes in school, but it also applies to everything when we enter into the adult world, the way that
yeah,
business runs, the way
yeah,
that institutions functions,
yeah,
the way that industries run, the way that our current trajectory with the environment and the climate disaster, everything,
yeah,
it's all connected, right? And so I hope that this really plants a seed, because I see anything that I contribute as being a contribution that stands with other good ancestors like yourself, who are also making contributions, each one just trying to do our part to
yeah,
say, hey, this may be helpful, this may be something that you weren't aware of. Let's integrate this into our learning and our growth. And I hope that each one of us planting these seeds within our spheres of influence, right, can help to create that ripple effect out. You don't have to write a book to
no,
do that, right? Like, I'm so inspired, and I'd love at the end for Mary from Lighthouse Books to talk about this, but I'm so inspired by that campaign that they are running to put a copy of this book into every secondary school in Scotland. I mean, wow,
it's amazing, and it's much needed, really needed. And it makes me really emotional to think about this generation of children or
yes.
adults, young adults,
Mm-hmm.
young people growing up to be like these really empathetic and kind of
Yes.
really aware,
Yes.
self-aware, and just amazing. It gives me goosebumps
Me
thinking about this
too.
generation of people, and really so much hope and optimism for the future.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the book, and it's amazing. And I could ask you so many questions about it, but I've always been really curious to know, how do you write? What is your
Mm.
process of putting a book together? And I'm sure some people
Yeah.
would be really interested in that as a writer.
Yeah. So I'm definitely not one of those people who like writes every day, always. I think part of it is that I work well under pressure. Like when I know that there's a thing that we have to get done in a certain amount of time. And I also have other things that I'm working on, right? And so with writing, it requires, and you know this, it requires so much research and learning and also reflecting, because it's not just about gathering information and then putting it into a book. It's really about what's my angle here, or what is the unique voice and the unique message that I'm adding to this information. And so a lot of, I think of the writing process, a lot of it is actually not the writing, it's actually the reading and the learning and the thinking, which extends for quite a period of time until I'm ready to say, okay, you know what? I feel like I'm ready to get cracking on this, right? And then in that period, I may not have all of the pieces, and I certainly don't. I mean, it's interesting with me and White Supremacy, because I think it's been quite a different approach than how you would traditionally write a book, because it started from an Instagram challenge.
Yeah.
But even so, I may have a kind of a broad overview of the things that I want in there, but I don't like plan each, like, then I'm going to talk about this, and then I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about that. I may like read something and then I'd be like, oh, that would be good to talk about, like within white feminism, because I think that applies there, right? Or I think that's a great story that I just saw on social media,
Yes,
right?
going
To
back
add
and
to,
forth. Yeah.
right, to add to this. But then when I'm ready to write, I basically create a metaphorical cave for myself. And I'm very grateful to have a lot of support from my husband and our nanny and my parents. You know, I need you to make sure that everything's okay with the kids, right? I'm just not going to be that available, right? And I notify my friends, I'm just not going to be able to catch up, you know, for the next few weeks or months, right? Because I need to just be with myself in this process. And I write, and I like writing in the library, and I was able to do that with the adult edition, because that was pre-pandemic. And so I wrote the entire Me and White Supremacy book in the Qatar National Library, which is a beautiful, beautiful space that is full of books that allowed me to really, I mean, it was incredible, because I was like, there are so many books from around the world about white supremacy and racism right here, you know. So that was really helpful. With the young adult edition, we were in a pandemic, so I had to write from home, and I had to figure out how to make that work for me, because I think physically leaving the house was like a ritual for me of, I'm now no longer Layla, wife, mother, all of these other things. I'm now Layla, writer, because I've left the house and I've gone to a different space. And so I kind of had to create that space in our home. But it was a good challenge for me. It was a good challenge, because it was like, if I can only write if I can leave the house, then that's not that's not going to be helpful if I can't leave the house, right? So I had to do it differently. But I like knowing that, okay, for the next 6 weeks, for the next 8 weeks, this is what I'm doing. And there's nothing else that I'm doing. I'm shutting everything else off to do this. And I like having quite a regimented approach when I do that. So starting and ending at the same time, having a like word count goal. So I can't stop until I've hit this many words, right? And it may be that that word count is across the week. So I'll divide that by 7 or by 5 or whatever it is. And so if I wrote less today, that means tomorrow I have to write more, right? To meet that word count. And that just keeps that rhythm going. And I really enjoy the process of, like, especially with the type of writing that I do, I love the process of being able to use both like sides of my brain. So how can I be creative, but also how can I be strategic? Because I'm trying to solve a problem, which is how to teach this in those bite-sized, accessible ways. What technically do I need to do? But also creatively, how can I make it varied? How can I have my personal stories from the media, stories from history, stories from the present day, and make it a cadence which feels like there's a familiar rhythm to this book, but I never know what she's going to talk about next, right? I don't know what story or what thing she's going to introduce next to teach this concept. And I like that, the creative side of that.
And it's amazing to hear you talk about that, because it's always, we've been talking quite a lot with other people about how we write, and especially as mothers, and with other caring responsibilities, and about not finding the time. But also I relate so much of you talking about that, just creating that hybrid thing, because a lot of my writing is like that as well. My first drafts are really messy, and they're really chaotic, and because I've just put everything together, and then it comes apart, and then it comes back together.
Right?
Yeah. And that is a painful process, isn't it?
You have such a wonderful way of writing that kind of weaves you this way. I'm constantly like, I want to highlight everything in the book, and I'm constantly like, how does she do that? But I know the process itself is messy. It's so messy.
Yeah.
But to get to the end, and that's why it's such a sweet moment, when you get to unbox your book, right?
Yes.
And
absolutely.
It's a physical thing, because what you had to go through to get there,
And sometimes you can't believe you wrote it yourself.
Right.
Like, how did I get here from that? I bet you feel like that, because I mean, there's so much in here, and with the scenarios, the way you talk about, and with the different kind of accountability, and it's a lot in here, and I mean, it's so rich, and it needs not just one reading, quite a lot of times to reflect on it, go back to it, think about maybe different stages. And it's not that you have to start the book when your child is 10 years old. Maybe you've started when they're 12 or 13 or 14-year-old, but then you can go back and do it.
Stage. Yeah, it's a good stage. And then I think emotionally as well, there's an aspect to writing a book, and I'm sure you can relate to this as well, because so often what we're writing about, things which are either our personal lived experiences or things that we're really passionate about and that are very important to us. And so there's an aspect of like the emotional processing as well that also takes time, and you can't put a time limit on it. So I count that emotional processing as part of my thinking and reflective time, because what I want is, when I sit down to write, is a clarity, a sense of like, I allowed myself the space and the grace to work through all of this stuff, because what I want this book to be is an act of service. And so I kind of have to both move out the way, but also fully activate my best self. Right. So that my best self is writing this book, and so that it can speak to that best self in the reader.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Because these are painful sometimes and triggering things to talk about as well. I remember when I wrote Sway, my first book, through the process, there were times when I really had to sit with it and think about my own experience, and just remove myself from what I was writing, as you say. And there were times when it really struck a chord in me that I was unlearning some of my biases while writing and reading and researching as well. So you're growing.
It's very humbling.
It's
very, very humbling. And it's a reminder that we're constantly on this journey as well. And so when people use words like experts or this or that, it makes me so uncomfortable.
Yes.
Because I'm like, what does that mean? You know what I mean? Like, what does that mean? I'm still figuring it out as well. But it's a very humbling thing, especially when what your intention behind it all is, may this thing that I'm putting together be of service in some way. And in order to be of service, we also have to allow ourselves to feel whatever it is that we feel.
But also, I think I do agree with your point about experts, but when people call you expert, it's probably because you have learned and unlearned and integrated all that in an accessible way that gives people the tools and strategies to do that. I could talk to you forever, but I have these questions that need answering from. We have the Intercultural Youth Scotland, which is a group that works with youth in Scotland. Really important work they're doing, and they've sent some questions for you beforehand.
Fantastic.
Their first question is, as anti-racist educator, it can sometimes be overwhelming given limited time and resources to know what to prioritize when working with young people. How do you decide what to include and how to structure the book? So I think we've touched a little bit on that, but I have more to say on how do you prioritize it.
I think, again, my journey was a little bit different because it started from an Instagram challenge that already had a structure. But one of the things that I realized as I was kind of doing this adaptation or writing this new book was that there were some things in the adult book that were just not that relevant to young people. It's not that it's not relevant, it's just it wasn't relevant in the same way. And so
Okay.
there were some things that I chose to actually take out because I'm like, you know what? When they get to an older age, this will be more important for them to
Mhm.
recognize. But what's actually going on in their day-to-day lives as young people? What are they seeing? What are the conversations they may be having? What is being confronted from day to day? And let's prioritize that, because I think all of the information is important, and giving that context and that background is important. But I think if they can't understand how it functions in their actual lived lives,
Yeah.
it just feels like, okay, here's another subject I have to learn about, right? As opposed to, this is something that I saw just the other day at school or at
This is
college,
so
or this
important,
is,
Layla.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, absolutely. And I
yeah,
think it's the teacher and educator in you that's coming out while you're doing that,
mm-hmm,
because there's subjects like, I mean, I used to hate physics at school. I did it at A level,
yeah,
but I
me
couldn't
too.
really figure out why I was doing
Right,
this, because they didn't make a link to what I was
right,
doing in my everyday life, or
right,
what processes I was seeing. So I think it's so
yeah,
important. And
yeah,
that's a great answer. Their
yeah.
second question is, we love the tone you created in the book, which is one of patience, understanding, and
Mm.
love. Could you discuss how you balance this tone alongside the difficult and sometimes sad information you present?
Yeah. So I think um that was the processing I had to do, because if
Yeah.
I'm very honest, the emotions I actually felt when I started on the process were anger and grief. And I was there for a very long time, because what this process brought up for me was actually a lot of inner child stuff. It brought up, I was thinking of myself at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and beyond, and some of the experiences I had, and wishing that I hadn't had them, and feeling it was all just so unfair.
Yeah.
And also feeling that it was so unfair that we even have to talk to young people about these things, that these are things they have to experience and understand.
Mm.
um, and so I was in anger and grief for a really long time, and I had to just tell my publishing team, like, this is where I'm at, and what I want to do is write with that tone of love and patience and
Mhm.
compassion and grace, but I'm not there. This is where I am. So you're going to have to let me step back and just let me sit in this. And when I'm ready, I will return to it. And I think doing that allowed me to get to that place, because I had honored how I felt. I had honored I had honored it, and I had transmuted it into something else, as opposed to trying to use a tone of love that was actually superficial,
Mm.
and that was actually bypassing. I think that can be felt when it's not
Yeah.
real. It can be felt. And in writing this book, that I said it was like two books, it was like, I want kids of color to feel really seen and protected, and I want them to feel whatever it is that they feel, but I don't want to pass on my triggers to them.
Yeah.
And also with white kids, or kids who have white privilege, I wanted them to feel like, this isn't something you're being blamed for.
Yeah.
This isn't something I'm saying you should be ashamed for. I actually want to invite you into this process. But while I'm in anger and grief, I can't do
You
that. I
can't.
can't do both of those things at the same time. So let me do me, and then I'll come back to this. And so in doing that, I think I was able to show up to the work just a more whole, and with a focus on, we're going to tell the truth, and the truth hurts and is uncomfortable. But at each step of the way, I would sweep back again and again through the words to see, is the tone here one of, we can change the world? This is what it is. It's harmful, it's hurtful, it's not okay. I don't what's the word, like sugar,
Quote.
what is the word?
Sugar
Sugarcoat,
quote.
that's it.
Yeah.
Sugarcoat it, right? I don't sugarcoat it. I'm not like, oh, this thing, and it's not very nice. No, people are dying,
Yeah.
right? This is harmful. This is causing harm. And you can do something about it. Let's do it together. we can change the world, right? And so that's the process that I had to go through.
Yeah, thank you so much for that is great, because I think first of all it shows that kind of consideration towards the readers and the audience, where you can reflect on how they will receive the information. I think it's really such an is mature, I think, and such a nice way of looking at that, because sometimes when we write, we can write just for ourselves, and that can be such a selfish process to do that when we're not
let me go write in
considering.
my journal, right?
Yeah.
Let me go publish this in my journal.
But I think
first,
again,
right?
and the anti-racist education, or talking about race or privilege or power and white supremacy, people sometimes think that would frighten the kids or scare them or make them feel threatened, or all those guilty, shame, and all those kind of emotions. And I really like how you put it, that these are all valid emotions, and I completely agree what I say as well, that ultimately they have to be an empowering process, saying these things are happening, but here are
and
the
they know
tools.
it's happening. They see it's happening. They're actually, they're not protected. Either they're experiencing it, right? They're on the other end of experiencing it, or they're seeing it and they're confused by it and they don't know why it's happening. And the adults in their life are not able to have nuanced conversations with them about it. And it doesn't allow them to figure out what that means for them, right? So it's a huge disservice when we don't talk to them about it.
Yeah, I think when I do some like workshops with parents and schools, they've said, why are we talking to children when they haven't mentioned anything? They don't notice color, or they don't. And I've always said, even if they are not said anything, that means they're making their own assumptions about things.
Absolutely.
And they're making their own judgments about things and forming their own perceptions about it. And you are not intervening to support them in that journey. And I think that is why it's so important to sometimes broach those conversations, to come and say, it's okay to talk about these things. It's not shameful, or it's not something that we have to hide away from. And I think that is what the book does, to open up those conversations with that age group, especially, which is such a tricky age, when they're going to step into the world.
Absolutely. I mean, they're on social media, they're seeing everything. So they are seeing it. And we know that, as kids, we start noticing racial differences from a very young age. And then we start making biased thoughts about it from a very young age as well. So it's happening regardless of whether they're saying anything or not, or we're saying anything or not. And we have to, like you said, intervene to replace the societal messages with the truth, right? This is what you're seeing, but this is actually what it is. And that's why I'm just thinking about, when people say things like that, where they've never mentioned anything about it, and yet you have very young kids of color having their first acts of racism in nursery school, in preschool,
I know 3-4-year-olds. I talked to parents on my podcast that their 4-year-old child was there. The kids said they don't want to play with you because you're dark. And my child, I always thought, okay, I'm talking to them quite a lot, but then she started crying, saying, it's not fair that I'm the only one who looks like this in my school. And then we went to California, and on the airport, she came running to me. I've already seen a baby who looks like me, mommy. And it really broke my heart. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so important for them to see people and to believe that they are represented, that they are there. And also another thing is that we know from research from American Association of Psychology that children from a young age, but also young adults or children of all ages, when they experience bullying or racial bullying, it really affects their mental health and well-being. It has a huge thing. But not just that, bystander children who are witnessing these bullying or seeing other kids being bullied can have stress and anxiety and insomnia as well. It's so important to talk to everybody, not just because they're targets or they're just not, it's not happening to them. It's just because it affects everybody, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's such an important point.
I think we've already answered this question and we're running out of time. What differences did you find in the process of writing The White Supremacy and Me, Young and Adult Young editions? And I think we've done that. So
I think we did that.
Yes. Thank you so much, Layla, for being here and for writing this book and for giving this gift to the world and to everybody. And I can't wait to see this in everybody's hands and just see just a whole generation of young people, young adults growing up really empowered. And
thank you, Prag.
And I'm going to just pass it on to Mairi from Lighthouse Bookshop, and just to say bye and thank you so much for joining, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is surreal to have my little face in Edinburgh, sharing this screen with Layla in Qatar and Pragya, who's in Dubai. And I'm so heartened, and my heart is so full, and I am so grateful that both of you, Layla, one of the most inspiring women we've had the pleasure of welcoming into the bookshop, and I'm so glad to have you back with us for this. This is my opportunity to plug the book again, and be the bookseller. It is an extraordinary feat of love, I think, as you said, and I think as the IYS team, Intercultural Youth Scotland, put in their questions, I think it's a book that touched young readers of colour, and from very different backgrounds in Scotland. And I think it's one that will touch many and make that difference and build that better world. Layla mentioned we are doing a crowdfunder. We are almost there. We are at 95% to get a copy of this book into every high school in Scotland. And every book will come with a resource pack with reading lists that are drawn from Layla's work and from Pragya's, that are about opening a door really in libraries to having these conversations and for schools to be equipped to have them. And we'll be sharing this video with them. So please, if you can, chip in or just share, get this book for yourself and for any small humans you know, and the adult edition for the adults that you know. Truly extraordinary books. So I will leave you with that, and a very big thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and huge thanks to you both.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Thank you so much, Mari. Thank you for everything. And thank you, Pragya, for an incredible conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you so